All right, hello students. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is, of course, the sociology of youth and religion. Okay, so the lecture on science and religion amongst youth, possibly due to my commentary, became a little bit overlong, so I split it. There wasn't a great spot to split it, so I sort of split it randomly. I tried to catch so all the themes were concluded and then jump to different themes, which I think I've done. So here is your second part. I apologize, for the length, but really interesting, I think, and kind of thinking over this. Obviously, this is an issue that I'm really passionate about. One of the formative experiences of my youth, I suppose, my salad years, if you will, what was taking CHRTC 350 at the college at St. Joe's, which is science and religion with Dennis Lamoureux. And as it turns, time is a funny thing. I've TA'd for that class, and Dennis Lamoureux is a good friend of mine now. So passionate about the subject, and I've spent half a decade just like reading everything I could find on the subject and on some of the debates, especially like the New Atheists and guys like Richard Dawkins. So I'm sorry, I have a lot of commentary and a lot of this, I feel, having wrestled, I think, deeply with these issues, where I find things to be maybe a little bit shallow and people who have not considered things, I put in a lot of commentary. So I apologize in advance. I do have a lot to say about this topic, and some of it I don't know, maybe sounds judgy. I don't know. I'm not. I'm usually very nice and very non-judgmental, but there are certain things that I actually find quite difficult to stomach, and some of these happen to be in this particular subject area. With that said, I've now talked for 2 minutes on this slide, making this section even longer. Enjoy the rest of this kind of section on science and religion amongst youth. And my commentary on the flaws that I find in people's thinking. Which again, I'm both sorry and not sorry for. Okay, so interestingly enough, one of the other things that Smith suggests is that, well, in the past, right, certainly with the boomers and with Gen Z, one of the trends that we sort of saw was that going to college, right, tended to be negatively correlated with continued religious faith into emerging adulthood, right? That those who were most educated tended to then become less religious. That no longer seems to be the case amongst American youth. The effects actually seem to have reversed, right? Where those who don't go to college are less likely to enter emerging adulthood interested in faith, and those who do go to college are more likely to be religious. And there's a ton of data, following the National Study of Youth and Religion too. Other studies and stuff from like the comparative election study, the general social survey, right? And you can find this, say, like on Ryan Burge's blog, graphsaboutreligion.substack.com. Great little page if you're interested in the sociology of religion. That actually now, and I actually think this is broadly the case. I think this has probably been the case for a long time, but there were some obscuring factors that made it look different. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be middle class. The more being middle class makes you more likely to be religious at the end of the day. But okay, it's an interesting effect, right? We've essentially, when we talk about who is in kind of religious congregations now, the middle or the working class has basically disappeared, right? In all but kind of small quantities, and like say in the U.S., amongst Latinos, it's still there. But in a lot of cases, those who are just high school educated have very much fallen out of faith altogether. And it's become a sort of middle class undertaking, which I think, again, kind of interesting. But yeah, so those who don't go to college now are less likely to enter emerging adulthood interested in faith. Now, what does Smith say? Right? Smith theorizes, and I think this has some validity, that basically education, in a sense, has sort of changed as well, right? That education today, and you're all here, in a university, you're all going to understand this in some way, right? And when he sketched out, our sketch of the millennials earlier in the course, right? What did Smith say? Education is of instrumental value, right? And what is the big thing that people want out of education today is a credential. So much as it may disappoint stuffy sociology professors like yours truly, and I do enjoy talking to people, especially about these topics, and I do love being a stuffy professor. Most people now are attending university not because they're deeply interested in bettering themselves, in learning about the great tradition, and engaging in deep philosophical arguments or understanding philosophy in a deep way and engaging in the great literary works. It is fundamentally in order to earn a credential, right? That Bachelor of Arts or that BSc or what other, Bachelor of Nursing, Medicine and Nursing, right? Fundamentally, those degrees are credentials now. And so, where education used to be a way of figuring out your beliefs, now it's a way of getting that credential, right? And so it's lost, in a lot of senses, some of its fundamental power, right? Because you're no longer turning to professors, in a sense, as these great sages who can tell you the truths of life. You're turning to people who are going to give you a grade so that you get a GPA, so that you get a degree, so that you can get a good job, right? So that on your CV or on your resume, you can put that you have a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Alberta with a major in sociology and a minor in French fry culinary techniques. Sorry, I'm joking. I'm not saying a sociology degree is useless. You can draw your own conclusions. And you're like, why am I here? Because because the course is interesting. So people aren't using education that way anymore. It's much more of a credential, which has blunted the ability of education, in a sense, and college education to shape people's worldviews in some sense, according to Smith. And I think he might be right. Okay, so most of the young Americans that Smith and Mangloss sort of studied, Smith and Mangloss say, basically, those who became non-religious, they said, come from the weakest, least religiously committed families, not from the religiously strong, committed families. And this is what Smith refers to as marginal peel-off. And I've talked about this before, right? Who gets peeled off of religion is those who are already marginal, right? So those who, and I mean, this is like Glenn Stanton's argument too, and a little bit of Philip Jenkins's argument, right? When we talked about the nuns and the religious landscape, that's all those who were marginal, right? Who were, I'm a Methodist. I don't know why I made that accent. I'm sorry. They hadn't entered a Methodist church since last Christmas or last Easter, right? They aren't active members. They're very marginal, but they had a religious identity. But it's a very, very marginal one. Right? Why did they have a religious identity? Well, because everyone did at the time. And still today, right? There are marginal Catholics, right? There are marginal Protestants. There are marginal evangelicals. There are marginal Muslims. There are marginal Hindus. There are marginal Sikhs, right? And it's those people that Smith say are the ones that get peeled off. Okay, for that particular group of people, the challenges of science to religious faith often plays a key role in the loss of an already weak faith. Oh, okay. Makes sense, right? They are, according to Smith, extremely vulnerable to popular versions of atheist arguments, right? That there's a sky daddy floating around in the sky who cares about what you do with your genitalia, right? Or, caricatures from people like, say, Richard Dawkins, who is a brilliant biologist and a terrible philosopher. Just FYI. His book, The God Delusion, is not good. If you would like to know more, come see me. I'll tell you all about it. Or Christopher Hitchens, or what's his name? Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Peter Boghossian, and a whole slew of kind of writers. And I think now it's shifted to, YouTubers like Alex O'Connor, formerly known as Cosmic Skeptic, Rationality Rules. I don't remember his name. Apologies. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. I would say it's like Steve Shives, right? I think of all these like YouTube atheists that have a big popular following. Um, and I mean, some of them, I'll say Alex O'Connor is actually pretty good. um, his earlier works, like when he was younger, he was a teenager when he started making videos. They were quite unsophisticated. Now he's gone and done, I think, a PhD in philosophy of religion, and his arguments are very sophisticated, and a little bit beyond me for the most part. Though I can be clever if I try. Um, but yeah, popular versions of atheism. I think here mostly like Hitchens and Dawkins and Boghossian, people who are not, I think, their arguments for atheism, I think, are not tremendously sophisticated. They're very popular level, but for those who are already marginal, some of those arguments are going to make sense, right? And they don't have the deep kind of faith embedded to really make those distinctions in a particularly serious way. And they might not be interested, right? They're not that religious, and someone comes and makes what sounds like a reasonable, or at least in the case of someone like Hitchens, very rhetorically persuasive, if intellectually somewhat empty, kind of argument. It can be very, very appealing to them. I love this little comic. Okay. Yeah, and I think there can be this fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between science and religion, which leads, a powerful force leading those marginally religious youth away from faith traditions that they were only loosely integrated in, right? Because they're not deeply integrated. They don't. Maybe, I can certainly say this of most of the people that I know that say walked away from, whether Roman Catholicism or evangelicalism. And I mean, I won't say that all of them who stayed are deeply sophisticated, but those certainly the ones I know that walked away from Roman Catholicism, when questioned, say, about Roman Catholicism, they know less than nothing. I think I have one good friend of mine, and he constantly says things, though raised Roman Catholic, he constantly says things about Roman Catholicism which could easily be dispensed of in 5 minutes. By actually just looking at a primary text, say the Catechism or the Code of Canon Law. The fact that he's not particularly interested in doing so and rather stays in the misconception, I think is interesting as well. But he was marginally attached, right? And then, became marginally disattached, right? And it was very much these kind of, popular arguments, which again, I think are kind of lousy. But, and I might be being generous, David Bentley Hart, I think, said of Dawkins's argument in the God Delusion, it was the worst argument made for or against a proposition in the history of human thought, which, that's probably a little harsh. But, nevertheless, sorry, I'm just flouting my strange knowledge of the kind of atheist debate, because I was fascinated with it for like 5 solid years, and I read everything that I could find, and I read Dawkins, and it was terrible. And I read David Bentley Hart, and, he's a jerk, but he's funny. Very funny jerk. But yeah, I mean, you can see where these popular discourses that are pitched at a very rhetorically effective and emotionally appealing level could draw people who are marginally attached away, who don't have a deep investment in faith, and probably don't have a lot of knowledge, right? So there you go. All right, so the growth of the nuns in the US and the decline of religion is driven in major ways by younger people becoming nuns. This is what we call a cohort replacement effect. The younger cohorts are not stepping in to replace the older cohorts. So as the older cohorts die, the percentage of people who are religious declines, right? Remember when we looked at Quebec, right? We looked at all those charts from Quebec when we looked at the religious landscape. And I said, most of this is not people who were Catholic exiting the church, right? Most of this is actually old people dying who said they were Catholic, although being Quebecers, they probably weren't. Not in any meaningful sense, I think. I'm very mean to Quebec. I'm sorry. Francophone, not Quebecois. Don't like Quebec that much. And they don't like me, so it's okay. So, they were but they had that Catholic identity, And as those younger generations are not replacing them and not identifying as Catholic, that the number of Catholics declines, the number of nuns increases, right? So it's a cohort replacement effect. If the younger generations don't replace a cohort that's dying, then you have a shrinking of that cohort, right? And I mean, I just saw figures from Ryan Burge looking at, if some of the major denominations in the U.S. had kept up with population growth, where they would be. And I think like the Southern Baptist Convention, if it had just kept up with population growth, there should be like 14 million of them. There's about 9.5. The United Methodist Church, if they had kept up with population growth, there should be like 8 million Methodists. There's like 2.5 million. So there's a definite cohort replacement effect going on, or a lack of cohort replacement. Okay. When it comes to Catholics, right? So if you're Catholic, your peeps got a lot of work to do. You maybe want to dial up Pope Francis on the old God phone, and tell him that you got some problems. I'm sure he's aware, but no, I mean people have been aware of this for a long time. Nobody knows what to do about it, right? All efforts to just staunch the bleeding have essentially failed. But Catholics play a disproportionate role in this. They contribute about half the formerly religious nuns. Half of them. Even though Catholics only make up 20% of the population. So they're over-contributing. Catholics are over-contributing wildly to the growth of the nuns. And we saw that, the Canadian numbers. We see that as well, right? According to Smith, the questions of science and religion and their conflicts seem to be playing a central role, especially for those marginals. So, I mean, not surprisingly, right, if you follow the sort of Catholic YouTube space, you might be aware of a cat. His name's Bishop Robert Barron. He's made a lot of noise about this, right? One of the really cool things he did, what I thought was neat, and I bought these for one of my friends who's a Catholic school teacher, who very, very Catholic, super Catholic lady and a great friend. But their poster's a famous Catholic scientist. People like Georges Lemaitre, basically the person who originated the Big Bang Theory. So questions of science and religion seem to... So people have been aware that these questions sort of play a big role. While some steps have been taken to address it, it remains a big kind of cultural problem because it's a huge cultural narrative, right? Where people assume that science has the truth and religion doesn't. So who you're going to listen to. And then if someone with a little bit of scientific credibility, like a Richard Dawkins, old Tricky Dick Dawkins, comes across and tells you this religion stuff is nonsense, well, that credential of being a scientist is probably going to carry some weight. Okay, now to the slide that makes me a little nuts. Okay, so this slide makes me a little nuts. So these are quotes from the Manglos, Weber, and Smith document that's attached. They come from sweet Jordan, who was raised Catholic and was 26 at the time. Okay, so I'm just going to read these and I'm going to react to them. This is going to be like a little YouTube reaction video. Thankfully, you can't see me. I'm pulling out my hair right now. I don't have any hair, if you know me. I'm completely bald. But, if I did, these quotes would make me hurt inside and pull my hair out. All right, if there's one thing about religious education, there's two kinds of problems. There are those who come out very indoctrinated, and then you have people who just completely fall away. I was the latter group because ultimately there's a lot of questions you can't answer. One is the classical, if God is omnipotent, can he create something he can't lift? Or why is there human suffering? Okay. And why does this make me crazy? Okay, if God is omnipotent, can he create something that he can't lift? This is a classic kind of got you question. It's also kind of a dumb one. And there's lots of people that have answered this question in, I think, very satisfying ways. And if Jordan had bothered to use the internet and look, right, there are lots of really interesting and really nuanced philosophical kind of responses to this, right? Amongst which is, God is not a thing in the universe. God does not lift things in the way that we think about them, right? So the question is sort of nonsense. And, it's, sort of from a logical point of... Anyway, I don't need to do an apologetics of this. It's a dumb question. And it's been used as this kind of gotcha question for a long time. Or why is there human suffering? This one, I will say, drives me a little crazy because, only because I've heard this a lot. And one of the things that I'll say is whether you buy the arguments or not. And you don't have to, certainly. But all of the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, they all have an account of why there is human suffering and explanations of why there's human suffering. Now, you may find them unintelligible, you might find them unpersuasive, sorry, Jordan makes me a little crazy. The oldest book that we have of the Old Testament is the book of Job, right? We think written the earliest. So, scholars generally date it somewhere between the 7th and 4th century BC. It's very, very old. The book of Job is an extended sort of meditation. And if you read this as a literal story, it's crazy. But it's not. It's an extended meditation and philosophical treatise on why is there suffering, right? And at the end of the book, God appears to Job, I think in a whirlwind, and he gives this reply, like, why is there suffering? And part of it is like, God's like, look, you're just a little puny mortal, you can't understand why I do the things I do. It's like, who are you even to question me? And that's the answer. Again, you don't have to find that compelling, but it's certainly there. Thomas Aquinas gives his accounts of why is there evil, right? The problem of evil and the problem of suffering, right? It's in Aquinas. It's in, certainly contemporary people like David Bentley Hart have given accounts of this. David Bentley Hart wrote a whole book called The Doors of the Sea, all about, his meditation on the problem of evil after the Asian tsunami. So to say that there are, questions that, that you can't answer is to me, again, suggests to me that Jordan was never exposed to an intelligent religious person that could offer some kind of argument for these things. And again, like I said, I think this is, to me, this fundamentally poses a serious problem, and I see why Jordan was marginal, right? Because he was offered none of these answers by anyone intelligent. Now, look, I'll say, I don't know, maybe when I was 26, I'd like to think I was smarter than Jordan. But certainly I don't know that I'd heard all of these arguments, and obviously I'm in my 40s now, and I've heard a lot more things. I've read a lot more books. But the fact that, this is what Jordan thinks bothers me a little bit. Because again, while you might not like those religious arguments, and certainly I don't like all of them, I don't think a lot of them are persuasive. They're definitely there. There are religious answers. So I have a tough time understanding what Jordan's talking about, which is why I said this slide drives me a little crazy, which I made it. So I'm a masochist. All right, another quote from Jordan. I now understand the natural process and the Big Bang and all that stuff. I also understand the first mover problem, being that something can't come from nothing, and therefore you had to have a creator. Well, then you're going to have to put the same logic to the creator, that he had to come from somewhere or from something. You run into an infinite loop where it goes constantly higher and higher circles. This is the turtles all the way down, as it were. This is again an old kind of argument. This is what's called the argument from infinite regress. And Jordan gets this actually almost entirely wrong. And again, like, this suggests to me that Jordan simply just no one really explained to Jordan how he got this wrong. So I think it's interesting. And he does know the first mover problem, which is good. Jordan's doing better than some people. But he misunderstands the argument from infinite regress. And what bugs me is that this is exactly the argument from infinite regress that Richard Dawkins makes. I recognize Dawkins' argument in what Jordan's saying, so I suspect that's where it came from. The argument from infinite regress, just for the record, is a very old argument, but it's an argument against, classically against materialism, right? That you can't have an infinite regress of material causes. At some point, you have to reach what is philosophically. So this is Aquinas' argument. an uncaused cause, right? The first mover, something, in essentially in Thomistic language, God is ipsum esse, right? The very nature of being itself, or he is being itself, right? And so, he doesn't need a cause because he is sort of eternal, right? So God doesn't need a cause. That's the argument. But the Richard Dawkins kind of type formula, which, if you flip it around, it's like, okay, well, where did the universe come from? You get an infinite regress of material causes. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is Jordan's dumb. No, I'm kidding. Jordan's not dumb. But Jordan, certainly in being marginal, has misunderstood the argument, and I think has been susceptible to someone like Richard Dawkins, Tricky Dick Dawkins, who makes these sorts of arguments and actually fundamentally gets the philosophy wrong. And again, I'm sorry to argue against these points. I know I'm being insufferable to a certain extent. But again, it suggests to me, like I said, I don't really care if people believe in these arguments. I care if people get them right, and sort of admit that, say, religion does have good arguments, and they're complex and they're nuanced. They're not simplistic and dumb and for dumb people. That one drives me a little bit crazy, because obviously I know a lot of religious people who are not dumb, who are brilliant people, right, and make brilliant arguments. Whether I agree with them all or not is not the point. But the idea that, the God... that religion is defeated by, and religious faith is defeated by, these fairly silly arguments is hurtful to me in a lot of ways. Maybe because I've put more time into thinking about these things, and I'd like to think I've wrangled with much more complex notions of this. Anyway, I think what we see here, right, is again the prizing of scientific ways of knowing over religious ways of knowing in ways that really do distress me. And again, a kind of way of understanding the world that is strictly materialist in its orientation. That's what Jordan's kind of reflecting, right? And the fact, and I think why, maybe there's nothing anyone could have done to take Jordan from a marginal Catholic to a more grounded Catholic, right? I mean, a lot of it comes from family. But that, Jordan's Catholicism is sort of defeated by these fairly trite arguments. Really does bother me. And it suggests, right, like, and that how deeply that Enlightenment narrative has kind of worked its way in, that, religion is so stupid and so irrational that it hasn't even thought of a good answer to any of these problems. And somehow, Jordan has found nothing satisfying in any religious tradition that could answer any of these questions. And I think that's, where to leave this, like the success of not just science, but I think the narrative of scientific progress that comes from the Enlightenment is now so complete in society, right? That it's really hard to be a religious person. You have to apologize for not following the dictates of science. And we no longer, I think, have a rich notion of truth, and certainly young people don't seem to have a rich notion of truth that includes things other than, empiricist, materialist kind of causes as truth. And maybe I'm wrong, and something for the discussion of the week. But that's really my impression, and I think this research from Smith and Mangloss and from the National Center of Youth and Religion sort of confirms that. And on that depressing note, I'll leave this much too long set of lectures on science and religion amongst youth.